So this evening I'm in the John Oxley Library with Anna Funda. So welcome to the State Library of Queensland, Anna.
Thank you, Vicky.
It's terrific to have you here, and of course it's quite a momentous day because your visit to State Library coincides with the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yes.
And that obviously played a significant part in your literary career. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write Stasi-Land?
Well, when I was 20, I studied in Berlin, in West Berlin at that time, from 87 to 88. And I met at that time when I was a student people who had been kicked out of East Germany. They were largely artists and writers, a bit older than I was. And we would sit in cafes in Kreuzberg, and at the end of the street there was this monstrous wall, which we all really thought was a permanent fixture. And if anyone ever mentioned anything about it possibly coming down, they were kind of laughed at. And then the next year, at the end of the following year, it was down.
Wow.
And I'd always been intensely curious about what kind of place kicked out people like my friends, the best and brightest or most vocal writers mainly, and also artists. So once it came down, I was able to go and find out.
So actually I worked with someone some years ago who actually lived in East Berlin and jumped over the wall. So did you have many conversations with East Berliners in actually doing the research for your book?
Yeah, so Stasi-Land is about really four main people who resisted the regime. The East German communist regime and its secret service, which was called the Stasi, ran a dictatorship behind the wall where people were locked behind the wall, they couldn't travel, and they were spied on. So the whole system ran as there was one person in every 7 was spying on others and reporting back to the Stasi. So really I was interested in what kind of courage it takes to resist that regime, and I met, without any trouble, ordinary people, one of whom, like the person that you know, tried as a 16-year-old to climb the Berlin Wall in 1968. So that story, which anchors the book, is really about resistance and its consequences and courage and its price. And then on the other hand, I went and talked to ex-Stasi men in the 90s, so after the fall of the wall, to see how they were dealing with the end of the world as they knew it. So Stasi-Land is really a kind of an act of witnessing, but also a collage of these stories from either side of a very divided nation.
Yes, as you say, it's an extraordinary episode in our lifetimes that we probably never imagined we would see prior to it actually coming down.
No, I know. I mean, I really feel that reality outstrips credibility, you know, then as and now. I mean, in a way, you could say that we live in a kind of surveillance state that the Stasi never even dreamed of, not run by nations, but by corporations. And then the world was divided into East and West, as you know. So, yeah, I think it takes a lot of thinking for a writer or an artist to get their head around reality because it's so absurd. You know, I wanted to write a novel at first, and then I realised that nothing that I could put in it that was true about that regime would be credible. So I had to write it as non-fiction.
So can you tell us a little bit about the research and how you undertake your research? Are libraries part of the research that you do?
Yes, libraries are incredibly important to me. They've been important to me my whole life. I can't imagine a world without libraries. I mean, libraries are just this most extraordinary repositories of everything that's ever been thought and every bit of literature that's ever been imagined. They are free, they're available to everybody, they're welcoming. I have been helped by more librarians than I could possibly tell you. They're sort of acts of social and intellectual generosity on a really grand scale. Sometimes it shocks me to realise that they haven't always existed, you know, that they are a function of the last, well, you can tell me, 150 years or so. And I just think they are really humanity's treasure troves.
They're certainly very democratic institutions and, as you say, open to all. Is there a favourite library that you have around the world?
I love all libraries. So I love the Victorian State Library, I love the library in Berlin, I love the Mitchell, I work in all of them. I love university libraries. I love my local library in Glebe, where I go with my children every week. I just love all libraries.
And I know that you've visited this library before. Is there a favourite space that you have at the State Library of Queensland?
I can never forget, I did a session here at a writers' festival maybe 10 years ago, I think, and it was in a room that was like this glorious rust-coloured red box sitting out over the river. And the river, for some reason, that day was green. It was a beautiful kind of luminous green colour. So we were in a red box sitting out over the water on this green river. It was absolutely divine. I can't remember a thing about what I said. I only remember the visuals of being there. They were so superb.
It certainly is a beautiful space, the Red Box. It's one of my favourite spaces in this building as well. And you mentioned coming to the Writers' Festival, and certainly our role is very much to support aspiring authors and writers, and we do that through things like the Brisbane Writers' Festival, our Black and Write program, and other programs like that. Is there any advice that you would have for an aspiring author?
I just think you need to write. If you want to write, you just need to write, because it's never really clear what you're going to write until you write it, what your voice is going to be until you do it. People tend to think that, you think and then you write in that order, but it's not. That's not necessarily the way it really works. You start and then the thinking comes in the writing, and the sense of who it is that's telling the story. You might have a writing persona that is like you but different from you, and you don't know that until you start writing. So I would just say, start writing. Come to the library, sit down, look at the river and start work.
We've certainly got great spaces to give inspiration. And when you're writing, do you set yourself challenges or set targets for how many words you're going to write a day, or what's your regime?
I work in the mornings, so I do the sort of heavy lifting of whatever new kind of work is going to come in the mornings. I sometimes think about it kind of slightly grandiosely as hacking away at a piece of like a piece of marble or a piece of stone or something. So where you're not sure what shape it is, the thing that you're going to uncover in there. So the sort of really concentrated thinking work happens for me in the mornings, and in the afternoons I can revise or read or look things up or check things or answer a million emails or judge a prize or blurb a book or write a recommendation for someone or come to a library and do an interview, or all the other many things that writers do that are not necessarily advancing the work on the page.
And do you read for enjoyment, or do you have other forms of things that you do to relax, to take your mind off things?
I do lots of things. I have 3 children, so I live in the world with them. And I exercise, which I think of as a fairly mindless but necessary thing. But really I live in a world of words, and I live in a world where, I'm happiest when I can tell this to you because we're sitting in a library. When I'm reading, I'm really happiest and most alive when I'm reading or when I'm writing. That's how I interact with the world. So that's what I do.
And going back to Germany, and you mentioned that you have been in Berlin and lived in Berlin. Have you been back in recent times? And can you tell us about the changes that you've seen in Berlin?
Yes, well, obviously Berlin was a city that had a wall right through it. Along the streets and along the rivers. It would be like having a wall that went through here and then right through the middle of town. So the changes have been absolutely enormous, and I've been back every year or two, sometimes to live for long periods and sometimes just to visit for those 30 years, really. I was there last year. The changes have been massive. So physically, it was a matter of knitting the city back together. The wall disappeared in tiny chunks. You've probably got one here or several in this library. I think they're everywhere. I think if you put them together again, you could probably build 4 walls. And then the city knitted itself back together. It has taken longer for the divisions in the minds and hearts of people really to knit back together. I think they they were very distinct. In its 40-year existence, East Germany really tried to create a different kind of German than had existed before, and to some extent was part of the communist project, which was to create different sorts of humans in the Eastern Bloc, ones that would, you know, happily share the products of their labour without getting reward. I mean, it's a kind of fantastical anti-psychological project. So there are still differences in the way people in the former Eastern states think than in the former Western states, but we are, you know, a generation and a half on, and even though those changes still exist, they are kind of ameliorating.
So you've had international success as an author for Stasi-Land as well as All That I Am, but you're also an international human rights lawyer as well. Being a lawyer, has that influenced the way you've approached your writing?
In the 90s, I was a baby international lawyer. I worked for under the Keating administration in the Attorney General's Department in the Office of International Law for Australia. So I was helping to negotiate treaties and to give constitutional law advice to the government, mainly in human rights areas and implementing international treaties in Australian law. Mostly what I value from that is a kind of residual understanding of what the law can try to do and where it might fall down. So the law is, in a sense, at an international level, setting standards, particularly human rights standards, which might be more observed in the breach, you know, more evident in the breach than in observance of them, but are nevertheless very important. I also have former colleagues, of course, who I'm really close to and like very much. But I left that because I just always wanted to write. I think I wanted to turn from examining how nations respond to their obligations to one another and to the people to actually what the lived experience is like in those nations. But the law gives you a very good grounding in how to understand society in one way. I mean, it's piecemeal, but it's also useful. So I think when Stasi men tried to blind me with the fact that their laws were so just and their ideals were so glorious, I think perhaps my legal training stood me in good stead and I was less easily overwhelmed by the beauty of an idea when its implementation was really very oppressive to people.
So your change to being an author as well has obviously been very successful with All That I Am winning the Miles Franklin as well, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I know this evening we've got a lot of people very eager to listen to you, and particularly on this anniversary, as I said, of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's really fantastic that we've been able to host you here at the State Library this evening, and I thank you for coming along and joining us. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of your stay in Brisbane.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so happy to be here.
Great, thank you.